Okay. Good morning, everybody. It's another great NASA and Goddard day, isn't it? Yeah. Unfortunately, it's raining, but we're working on weather control, so we'll see what we can do about that. Thanks to everybody for coming today to see Senator Cardin. He's come here for a town hall meeting. As you can imagine, he's taking some time out from a very, very busy time in Congress with our budget rolling out on Wednesday. They have a lot of work to do, so we're extremely, extremely pleased that Senator Cardin could find some time for him to come here and visit us today. And as you know, we've been very fortunate to have Senator Cardin and Senator Mikulski and our whole congressional delegation. They have been incredible supporters of not only the Goddard Space Flight Center, but NASA and all of you, all of us that work here at Goddard. We couldn't ask for better support. And let me just briefly give some background of Senator Cardin. He was here recently out at Wallops visiting, and prior to that, he's visited Goddard several times. In fact, he and I were on this stage about 6 years ago, more than that now, because you were running for Senate for the first term at that time, and I was the deputy center director at that time, so that's how long ago it was. But Senator Cardin has stayed very much engaged in it. He's been serving the people of Maryland since he was in law school. He was elected to the Maryland House of Delegates while he was still a member of the law school. So all of you who think you can't do two things at once, you're wrong. He was then elected to Congress in 1986. He served 10 terms in the U.S. House of Representatives, representing Maryland's 3rd District. In 2006, he succeeded Paul Sarbanes when he won his seat for the U.S. Senate. And he was reelected last year in November for another 6-year term. So we are very pleased to have you reelected and have you back representing us. And I'd like to welcome Senator Cardin to speak to us. Thank you, Senator.
Chris, thank you very much, and thank you so much for your leadership here. It really is a pleasure to be back at Goddard. I've been here many times. I've been here for a lot of happy occasions where we have launched projects or cut ribbons or welcomed international dignitaries and really happy times. Today is not one of those happy occasions, but I thought it was important to be here to be able to let you know what I think is happening in Washington and give you a sort of an insider's view, but also to listen to what your thoughts are. So this is going to be informal. It's going to be like a town hall meeting where you'll have a chance to ask questions, and I'll give you the best information I can about what's happening in Washington today. But I want to start first by saying thank you. I understand that Congress has a strange way of thanking you, but I am sincere of what you do every day to help our country, to help our community, indeed to help the world. The work that's done here is the best in the world. The information that you make available, the technology that you develop, helps save lives around the world. We saw that most recently in Hurricane Sandy. To be able to track that, this megastorm, and the amount of life that was lost was minimized as a result of technology and work that was done right here at Goddard. You save lives. You help our economy. You help create jobs. And I'm not just talking about the jobs that are created here, but how many companies depend upon the work that's done here to create the jobs that are critically important for our economy. How many small businesses rely upon the work that's done here? So I come here to tell you, thank you for your public service. You're on the front lines. You do your work the best in the world. And I want to make sure that you continue to do that. I want to say right from the beginning that I have a reputation of standing up for federal workers. I do that because of what you do every day, whether it's the scientific work that's done here in understanding the space and understanding Earth, which you do, or whether it's protecting our borders, or the work done at NIH and discovering the answers to the dread diseases of the world, or work that's done at FDA to keep our food supply safe. I could go on and on and on. And you have been asked to sacrifice time and time again to deal with our national budget problems. 3 straight years of freezes on salaries, asked to do more with less. You've stepped forward and have done a lot to help this country during these economic challenging times. But enough's enough. And it's time for us to stand up for our federal workers. So let me try to tell you where we are on these budget issues, because it's got to be frustrating for all of you to see what's happening in Washington. And I'm going to do this very quickly. I'm going to go back first 12 years ago. The reason I do that is because we had a balanced budget 12 years ago. That's not so long, 12 years ago. But then certain policies were enacted. We had a couple tax cuts. We were attacked on September the 11th. We went through a recession. And all of a sudden, we have unsustainable budget deficits. As we do, we have unsustainable budget deficits. About 3 years ago, President Obama looked at a commission known as the Simpson-Bowles or Bowles-Simpson Commission to say, what can we do in order to get our budget into proper control? It was not to try to place blame. It was a bipartisan commission that said, what do we need to do to have sustainable deficits? We can't allow our country to have unsustainable deficits and debts that are too big. And that commission came up with a recommendation that we needed over a 10-year period to reduce the deficit by about $4 trillion. That about 60% should be spending cuts, about 40% should be new revenues coming in order to have a balanced way to deal with our budget deficit. And it said, by the way, we want to do this in a way that doesn't jeopardize our recovery. So we want to continue to invest in technology and research, and in roads and bridges and modernization and energy, so that we can create the jobs that will help pay the taxes that will help balance our budget. It made a lot of sense. And I must tell you, of all of the reports that have come out, the Bowles-Simpson, Simpson-Bowles, not in its specifics, but in its general terms, was widely hailed as being the right type of a blueprint to get us back on track for our economy. So now, where have we done since Simpson-Bowles? How far along the way did we get? Well, we've enacted about $2.5 trillion of that $4 trillion. It's done. We have, as you know, gone through several rounds of budget cuts. You know about them. You've been suffered through them. And those budget cuts that we've gone through have significantly reduced discretionary domestic spending, which you all are a part of. We've also brought in some new revenue as a result of the deal we had at the end of this year. We were able to freeze in some of the tax rates at the higher income level that bring in revenue, about $600 billion of revenue. Simpson-Bowles said we needed $1.6 trillion of revenue. So far, we've brought in $600 billion of revenue. We've already done the discretionary cuts envisioned under Simpson-Bowles. So where do we need to go from here? Well, we need more deficit reduction. But the two areas that we have not yet dealt with in any significant way are our mandatory spending and tax expenditures. Mandatory spending, the money that we spend primarily on health care, we need to be more efficient in the way that we spend money in health care. That brings down the cost of Medicare, brings down the cost of Medicaid, brings down the cost to the private sector of health care, which is also something we need to deal with. So we need to bring down the cost of our mandatory spending. And yes, we need to deal with what economists call tax expenditures. It may surprise you to learn that we give away in tax expenditures as much money as we collect. These are provisions that affect some, not all taxpayers. Just to give you an example, We have a program in the Department of Energy that helps develop alternative energy sources for this country. That's been subject to 3 rounds of cuts under discretionary spending. In our tax code, we give tax breaks for the development of renewable energies. Those provisions have not been subject to change. We should have the same scrutiny on the tax side as we do on the spending side. So we bring in every year, we spend every year in tax expenditures about $1.2 trillion. That's a year, not tenure. We can certainly get some savings by looking at how we spend money in the tax code. So we have 3 budgets that are working their way through Congress. One budget is the budget that's passed by the House, which gets most of the savings, basically all the savings through spending cuts on both the discretionary side and on the mandatory side. We have another budget that worked its way through the Senate that gets savings from both mandatory savings and discretionary savings and from bringing in tax expenditures. And now we had the president's budget that came out this past week. That is similar to the Senate budget, but also is more aggressive in saving money on the mandatory side and includes Social Security in that budget. In the meantime, we've passed the date of March 1st. And as a result, we have sequestration, never intended to occur. None of us ever envisioned we would actually get to these across-the-board cuts. They make no sense at all. If you have a family budget and you run into a hard time and you have less income than you anticipate, and you got to cut your family budget. You might be spending some money on rent or your mortgage payment. You might be spending some money on feeding your family. And you might have some money budgeted for weekend trips. Now, you don't cut each of those categories the same. You look at your budget and see what you can do without on a temporary basis until you get things worked out. Well, sequestration doesn't let you do that. Sequestration says every priority in government's the same. That's not the case. We've got to get rid of sequestration. It is damaging. It's damaging to Goddard and NASA. It's damaging to our country. We got to replace it. And the Senate budget and the president's budget replaces it. Allows us to make the type of budget decisions that we have to make. It's particularly damaging to Maryland. Maryland has 5.6% of its workforce that work for the federal government. Nationally, it's 2.2%. We have a lot of contractors, a lot of small businesses that depend upon federal contracts in Maryland. The state of Maryland's estimated that sequestration in and of itself directly will cost us 13,000 jobs in the state of Maryland. So we really, for the sake of our country, but for the sake locally, we need to do something about it. Now, what I'm saying here is fully supported by your federal congressional delegation. Senator Mikulski, my colleague and a great friend of Goddard, who happens to be the chair of the Appropriations Committee. That is very good for our country because she understands the appropriations process. That's very good for Maryland, and that's very good for Goddard. So we have a real champion as chairman of the Appropriations Committee. There's no greater friend of Goddard than Steny Hoyer, the congressman from this region, who has been a true champion. I remember working with Steny not too many years ago when there were those in Texas trying to take Goddard out of Maryland, and when we stopped that from happening. And of course, Donna Edwards, another congressperson from this region. All of us are working together on these issues to replace sequestration. So where do we go from here? We need a bipartisan budget. It's not going to be what just President Obama wants or the Democrats. You've got to work together. We need a bipartisan agreement on the budget for a couple reasons. First, one of the great damaging impact on our economy right now is the uncertainty. We need predictability. You may not like a budget, but at least if you know what it is, you can plan for it. How do you plan when you have to work with temporary CRs? You can't. We've got to give you the predictability of a long-term budget agreement reached between the Democrats and Republicans. And secondly, We've got to have it done in a balanced way that not only manages our deficit, but allows for the type of growth that we need in our country, for job growth, that allows us to invest in research and development. You know, America is so strong in the basic high-tech, biotech areas. But if we don't invest in it, our scientists will go into other fields or other countries. We've got to invest in America's future, so we have to get this done in the right way. And that's what I'm committed to doing. I'm committed to sitting down, working with my Republican colleagues. We can never accept sequestration as the new norm. We can't. America depends upon the work that's done here. And we can't let you be shortchanged in finding the answers to tomorrow's challenges. We are pioneers. You represent that pioneer spirit. And we've got to work to make sure that we give you the tools in order to get that job done. I don't know how this will unfold in the next 4 or 5 months. I can tell you that the appropriators, and I serve on the Senate Finance Committee that has responsibility over that $1.2 trillion of tax expenditures. We're working to try to bridge the gaps between Democrats and Republicans and hopefully be able to come out with a blueprint before October 1 so that you have a predictable budget moving forward that's responsible for getting our budget back into better balance. That's what we're working for. That's what we're hoping to be able to accomplish. And I can tell you that I apologize for the fact that because Congress did not get its job done, and we didn't, by March 1st, we have self-imposed damage not only to you personally, but to the mission of Goddard and NASA that is so important to this country. We've got to correct that and get back on track. So with that, let me open it up to your comments and your questions. I'd be very happy to hear your concerns or try to answer your questions as to what is happening today on any of these issues that affect Goddard. I think they want you to use a mic. So.
Right, yeah. Use the mic, Joel. Do we have olives?
First, I absolutely agree with everything that you had to say. Wow. I have a question. You know, all these budgets that are coming forth are 2014 and on. President Obama's budget, as we just heard yesterday or the day before, would get rid of the effects of sequestration. 2014 and on. Is there any likelihood at all that something can be done the remainder of this year to undo what I think has been a terrible harm? I haven't heard anything said about that. The answer is probably no, but I'd love to hear a maybe.
Right. We're not going to give up on the 2013 budget, but I think it's highly unlikely that we will adjust the budget before October 1. So I think for the purposes of the remainder of this fiscal year, you have to live with these the equivalent of a 5% cut, which is really an 8 or 9% cut, because it's a full cut, but you have less months in order to deal with it. So if you're looking at it from, if this were to go forward, it's basically an 8% cut, or in some agencies as high as 10%. You know, the problem with sequestration, it didn't apply to 100% of the budget. It only applied to basically discretionary spending plus the providers of Medicare. So it was less than 50% of the budget subject to this cut. So those who say it's only 2%, it's not. It's really closer to 8 to 10% of a budget, on top of cuts that had already been imposed under 2 or 3 rounds of budget reductions. Right. You're absolutely right. We should get out of this as quickly as possible. If we could do it next week, you have my vote. Not only my vote, I'm urging us to do it. I think it's unlikely, though, we can get it done before October 1.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, other questions? Yeah. Well, if you have a question, you just go to the microphone and we can do it from there.
Senator, I have a 20-year-old son, and he asked me, what is this sequestration and how do we get here? And, you know, he's a new voter, and I say, well, it's like when people can't agree, you use a rule to figure out what to do with your budget. So I just wonder, is there a better answer for the young folks out there about how our government operates?
No. No, there really isn't a better. I want to back up just for 1 second. Give me a moment here. We have the best democratic system in the world. And it doesn't look really good right now. But I wouldn't trade our system with any other system. But it has not worked well. And we've had divided government before, where the House and Senate have been under different party controls, and the Congress and the White House have been under different controls. And we've been able to work out these differences. What happened, how we got to sequestration, is a lesson that we should never repeat the circumstances in the future. We have this arcane system of where we spend money and then we have to raise the debt limit in order to pay our bills. Makes no sense at all. The controls is when you spend the money, not paying your bills. You got to pay your bills. But the Congress, the Republicans in the Congress, used the raising of the debt ceiling as an opportunity to reduce overall spending in the future. And as part of that, there was an agreement to try to get to this $4 trillion goal. As you know, the president put certain grand bargain proposals on the table, but could never get the Republicans to agree on the revenue component of a grand bargain. So we weren't able to get there. So we put $1.2 trillion as a placeholder on the table, i.e. sequestration. It was never meant to take effect, but it was a placeholder for $1.2 trillion. It only could apply to discretionary spending. Why? Because discretionary spending, you can put a cap, an enforceable cap on. You can't do that on mandatory spending without changing the law. And we couldn't agree as to how to change the law. You can't do it on tax expenditures without changing the law, and we couldn't agree on how to change the law. So the only enforcement mechanism that we could agree on dealt with discretionary spending and Medicare provider cuts, basically. That's how we got there. But the Democrats and Republicans said at the time, it won't ever happen. How would Republicans allow for automatic cuts to defense spending? It can't happen. And how could Democrats ever allow us to go through automatic cuts on our priorities on the domestic side? Never happened. Well, it happened. So I don't know what you tell your son. The answer is don't play with fire, and that's what we did. And as a result, people are getting hurt, and they really are getting hurt. It's not the way to do business. We should never have done business this way. Now, let me just talk on an optimistic side. We've seen some really encouraging signs in the United States Senate. We saw one of those yesterday with the vote on gun safety legislation, the universal background checks. I don't think many people thought we could get 68 votes in the United States Senate to proceed on gun legislation. That's 8 more than we needed. We're going to pass gun safety legislation in the United States Senate, and I expect it'll get through the House also. It's not what I wanted. I wanted universal background checks. We're going to get that. I wanted to get rid of straw man sales. We'll get that. But I wanted to get rid of these high velocity clips and these assault weapons, and we probably aren't going to get that. But at least we're making progress. We have an immigration bill that looks like may get through the United States Senate. When you got senators like Senator Rubio agreeing with Senator Menendez and Durbin, we got something going on in the Senate that maybe, just maybe, will be able to get us working together on budget issues. I worked with a group of 4 Republican and 4 Democratic senators to move forward some changes on our filibuster rule. Nobody thought we could get that done, and we did. And I'm working with Republican senators right now on the budget. I don't know where it will lead. So I think there's an encouraging sign in the United States Senate where I work that whether you're a Democrat or Republican, we've had enough. We believe in our principles, but we've got to reach decisions for the good of this country. So I sense that there is an improvement. But I don't want to mislead you. It's very difficult to negotiate with people who don't believe in negotiating. And we do have some in the House who really believe we shouldn't be negotiating. We can't do this on spending cuts alone. We need more revenue. You can't do it on spending cuts alone. President Obama is absolutely right in that regard.
Okay, other questions? Yes.
Senator Cardin, thank you for coming out in your busy schedule. With me today is a young student from Tacoma Park, a high school student who is doing work study at Goddard. And yet, just yesterday, we were called together in emergency meetings to discuss how education reorganization may affect all of us, especially contractors who are working here. I wonder if you have any thoughts or comments on budget influence on education.
Thank you for that question. From the budget that will end on September the 30th, I think we understand how we're operating. We're basically operating under current budgets that we've had for the last year at lower levels. I mean, so there is no elimination. There's certainly damage to all the programs. And as a result of that, there are things that we would like to do that we can't do, but we should not be dismantling the capacity to carry out our mission. So if it's in education, for example, we should, I hope, continue the capacity to be able to reach out and do what is necessary. The important part of what you do here is that you have a core mission. And whether that core mission is to develop a satellite that's going to help us navigate weather problems, or whether it's going to develop the instruments necessary to explore Mars, or whether it's whatever that's your core mission. But as part of that mission, you have responsibilities to motivate and inform the communities of America. And you do that. You inspire the next generation of scientists. You provide information that's valuable for the community to know about. And we don't want to jeopardize that important role that you perform, working with the community, working with our school systems, working with the general public. Now, what will happen October 1? I think we know pretty much where we are through the rest of this year. Well, Congress has not acted on your budget for October 1. The appropriators are starting their hearings this coming week. So we're going to start having appropriation committee hearings on both the House and Senate side. So there's going to be appropriation hearings. The president's budget contained some good news and bad news. First of all, his budget replaces sequestration. So we don't have sequestration if the president's budget were passed. Let me remind you, never in the history of America have we passed the president's budget without changing it. This will not be an exception to the pass. So we're not going to accept the president's budget. I got problems with the president's budget. Not the framework. The framework, I think, makes sense. He once again picks on federal workers. That's wrong. This 1.2% increase in the retirement phased in over 3 years is wrong. We reached an agreement. Chris Van Hollen and I were on a conference committee where we had proposals for the federal workers to do more. There was a compromise reached where new workers are going to have to pay more for retirement benefits. We didn't like it, but that was the agreement. We shouldn't be reopening that again. So I don't like that part of the president's budget. And I don't like that part of the president's budget that says at Goddard, your educational programs are taking a huge hit. I think that's wrong. But the appropriators will look at it. What I do like about the president's budget, gets rid of sequestration. I would like to see growth in these budgets, but at least we are able to maintain budgets. And it gives us the transition, I hope, to get to a responsible guide path for a controllable debt that will allow us once again to increase the priority areas which I consider NASA to be part of. So we have to work ourselves through, and I hope the political system will. I'm sure that the point that you're raising, you're going to make as we go through the deliberations on the budget. If we can get appropriation bills done, and I know Senator Mikulski is committed to doing that, then Congress will give the blueprint for that budget, which will include everything from the missions you have for putting new satellites in orbit to how you deal with your community outreach and educational programs. That's what Congress should do. It's not up to the president, it's up to Congress. And I believe that we'll get it right. So if we can get that done, if we can get the appropriations bills done, I think you have a much better chance to have confidence that you'll continue that mission in the future.
And let me just add a little bit to it on the education part, because we talked about it on Wednesday when the budget came out. There's a few things I think that we all have to remember. First, the content that shows up in textbooks, that shows up in museums, comes from us. That can't go away. As long as we're doing our mission, as Senator Cardin said, that content is coming from us. Those of you who've read the Space Act see that the Space Act says we're supposed to disseminate that information widely. I can't remember the exact words. I'm sure Andrew can remember the exact words, but that's close, right, Andrew? Yep, okay. And, you know, we're going to continue to move on, you know, what we're doing this year. If you're a civil servant, things are still going on. We still need to do all those things. If you're a contractor, same thing. We're still going to keep on doing that. And if you're a contractor, don't do anything different until you hear from your contracting officer, because we have rules that we have to follow as well. So when everything is said and done, as the negotiations go on between the administration and us and the Congress and the administration, it has to be recognized that we provide the content. We're the ones that are out there in the community working, you know, at the visitor center, working in the schools, bringing in interns and co-ops, and you know, we'll come out of this. I don't know exactly how, but I'm sure we're going to come out of it a little bit different than we went into it. Other questions? Yes.
The budget that the president unveiled this week angered both parties. You just said that earlier. And also the budget that the House unveiled a few weeks ago, Congressman Ryan really debunked some of the big programs that President Obama believed in, including health care. So amidst all those differences, do you really believe that there is a chance that we may have a budget, or should we anticipate that sequestration is here to stay?
It's an excellent question that you're asking. I just urge you, there are some who want you to believe that sequestration is the new norm. Don't ever accept that. Don't ever accept that. America's future depends upon a much more robust development of space, exploration, science, work done at NIH on exploring, providing the basic research. I could just go through agency, the important work you're doing. We can do better than that. We can afford more than that. This is a self-inflicted wound. This isn't a fundamental problem of not having the wealth to pay our bills. This is a self-inflicted problem that we can solve, and we have the blueprint to solve it. So don't ever accept the new norm as being sequestration. One of the frustrating parts, as I try to explain it, sequestration's not a cliff. January 1st would have been a cliff if we didn't deal with the problems we had. It was a very unusual New Year's Eve for me. I was working in the United States Senate. The first sight I saw on January 1st, for the first time in my 48 years of marriage, was not my wife. It was Patrick Leahy. I love Patrick. That was a cliff. If we didn't solve that problem, you would have known it that next week. You would have known it. Sequestration's is a slope. It's not a slope if you get a furlough notice. It's not a slope if you lost your job as a small business owner. It's not a slope if you have a rare disease that NIH now has to put on hold and will affect the quality of your life, or literally your life. But for the general public, it's a slope, and they don't see it overnight. It's not going to be a slope for the thousands of school children who lose Head Start placements. So this is going to be devastating to our country, but they won't know about it overnight. President Obama, Senator Mikulski, Congressman Hoyer, Congressman Edwards, this senator are committed to getting sequestration off the table. We will not accept it. So don't accept sequestration. How do you resolve the differences between a Paul Ryan budget, which in my view is so extreme and doesn't add up and would cause devastating harm, and President Obama's budget, in the blueprint of which I think is the right blueprint? How do you reconcile those differences? Well, that's what the political system's supposed to do. You sit down and you compromise. I've talked to Republican members of the United States Senate who basically support the Paul Ryan budget. And I've sat down with them and we've said, oh, look, why don't we accept what the Republicans are saying and do something about our health care costs in this country, accept what the Democrats are saying and do something about the money we give away through the tax code, and get those revenues, and everyone wins. So I think there is room to negotiate an agreement, and we're going to continue to work to try to negotiate that agreement.
Great, let's go over here, and then we'll come over here.
Senator, thank you very much for joining us today. I agree with what you're saying this morning, but I did have one question. The idea that sequestration is a very real threat, it seems like a low bar, perhaps because of my understanding of sequestration. It seems to involve both budget cuts as well as the imposition of those cuts in a mindless, mechanical fashion. Is it correct then that there's a very real chance of us imposing cuts in a similarly mindless fashion in the future? Would that be due to a continuing resolution? Or isn't there an option to impose cuts, but in a thought-out manner?
Right. Well, that's a very good point. If you can make your own decisions on where to cut funds, it would be far better than across-the-board cuts. But far better, I agree at that point. But the level of reduction is not manageable by agencies. We've had, as I said, several rounds of cuts already. So there's been, where you can cut things that are not important, you've already done that. This is not about choosing between unnecessary spending and necessary spending. You're choosing now between programs that are extremely important and those that are vital, and you only are doing the vital, eliminating extremely important. This is affecting mission. Even if you had discretion on where to place the cuts, you're going to have to affect mission, and I think some really very important parts of your mission. This is equivalent to about an 8 to 10% cut. Agencies can't take an 8 to 10% cut and still be able to do what you're expected to do. I'll give you one other agency example one more time, National Institute of Health. We were able in the 1990s, early 2000s, to get the funding doubled through NIH so that they could accept one out of every four eligible worthwhile grants. We're now down to one out of every 7 worthwhile grants. The private sector depends upon the research at NIH. The strongest proponents are the small businesses that depend upon this basic research. NIH cannot, the only place they can cut are going to be the grants with sequestration. That's not acceptable. So even if we give discretion, it's still way too high of a cut to be manageable to carry out the important mission of this country to remain competitive. We talk about, some things you can't change. You can't change globalization. We're in an international competition. We will not be as competitive as we need to be if sequestration goes forward. We're going to have a less educated, less trained, less research, less infrastructure that we need to be competitive, and we're going to be shortchanging our children and our grandchildren.
Okay, let's go over here.
Yeah, I was just interested that you had started by going back to the 1990s when we ran a surplus and told how we got here from there. But I remember that in the 1990s, we got to a surplus partly by Clinton closing the government down and using that threat to negotiate with people who didn't want to negotiate. And it seems like we're faced with the same situation now. Granted, the Senate seems to be improving, but the House is still impossible to negotiate with. I'm wondering if, come October, if you can't get an agreement, isn't closing the government down an option? It wouldn't be any worse than the sequestration or the furloughs
I don't know about that.
we're subject to, and it might have a bigger impact on the people who don't want to negotiate. And it seems to me that Obama has been too nice. The Obama administration has been too nice in the past, and that's what's got us where we are now, because it refused to close the government down to force a negotiation.
You're giving, I was part of that Congress. I think you're giving us too much credit that we thought that closing government down would accomplish our goals. We really didn't want to close government down. As you recall, it was Speaker Gingrich who thought it was a good idea at the time, and it backfired on him. It didn't work. But I think it was a Republican strategy, not a Democratic strategy at the time to close the government down. Just wanted to correct the history on that. We thought it was a horrible idea to actually close down government, and it caused a lot of problems. I mean, a lot of pain and a lot of problems. We're not a third world nation, people. We shouldn't have to go through closing government down or defaulting on our debt in order to prove a point. Let's do things the way that they should be done. And I take a lot of pride as being part of the Congress that did provide a surplus. And I give Bill Clinton a lot of credit. He did two things that were unpopular. He raised taxes and cut spending in order to balance the budget, did both. But I also want to give George Herbert Walker Bush a little bit of credit, because he started us on this glide path, taking on his own party and raised taxes when we needed to in order to start us on a glide path to balance the budget. So the bottom line is it's virtually impossible for one party to do this on its own. You're going to have to bring the political process together, and Democrats and Republicans are going to have to work together.
Great, and let's come over here.
I've been mulling this around in my head, and I haven't really been able to turn it into a question, so I guess it's more of a comment, really. You mentioned that, like Maryland, the state of Maryland stands to lose 13,000 jobs, I guess, because of sequestration. Well, two of those people were friends of mine, and you say that progress is being made. I like what I see in terms of movement on gun control and movement on immigration, but I'm a little worried it's too incremental and too late for some people. So I guess that's just something I would like to see taken back to the other members of the House and the Senate, that, while we are making some progress. I mean, if sequestration was never supposed to happen in the first place, well, it did, as you said. And if we have people who are willing to bargain with their favorite parts of either Medicaid or military spending, whatever you want to call it, I mean, where does that leave the rest of us? I guess that's sort of a question.
Yeah. No, I think what I explained a little bit earlier, we're on that slope. We're in there. I mean, when you're on the slope, people who are caught in it have been hurt. There are a lot of people who have been hurt. It wasn't a cliff. We didn't have millions of people overnight affected by it or knowing that they were affected by it. And the more we can personalize it, the better off we are. When I was at NIH, I met a person who had incurable kidney cancer, rare form. His only hope was to come to NIH. NIH found the answer to the problem. The person's alive today. He never thought he needed government and was not a big fan of raising taxes, or not a big fan of even getting rid of sequestration. He's now the loudest proponent of getting rid of sequestration and letting NIH have all the money they can get. So we got to personalize this. I was with Chris right before we came up here, and I saw the brochure you had on the Landsat, which showed the public value of what you do. You got to do that more often. You got to point out the public value of why we put satellites up in the sky, up in the space. You do that. We got to do a more effective job at that. And that these cuts come with a cost. It's not only your friend who lost his job, part of that 13,000, but it's also the fact we're going through this climate change, people. It's real. It's not just warmer weather, it's more extreme weather. And we need to have the technology to deal with this. Even if we all of a sudden change our attitude about climate change and reduce dramatically our greenhouse gas emissions, we are going to suffer through some really extreme weathers. We need to have your technology helping us deal with these problems. So we've got to do a better job so people understand. That's why I said, no, it's not giving you flexibility, it's giving you the proper resources to get your job done and the flexibility you need. You need both. And that's what we're fighting for.
Let's go over here.
Senator, thank you for your comments. Just in reference to that, I've just finished, as a result of sequestration, a project that was focused on looking at the strategic impact to the nation of climate change. So there's another good example for
Thank you.
My question to you, please, is you've used a number of different terms during your presentation. I'd like to pick up on one of them. You've used framework. Could you provide some further insight as to how the effects of sequestration are being collated and matched with the risk assessments that must have been undertaken when sequestration was being put together up on the Hill? And please, how that is going at both an operational and a strategic level.
Right.
Clearly, this is impacting the public, the private sector, and many other areas of the economy. How is this being collated so that you can, in fact, do your data analysis?
Wow. It just shows you that when Congress says that America needs to have more people trained in STEM, in the basic sciences, that we don't have enough training, we have to do a better job. Your question very much points out the lack of that training among the members of Congress. Because we didn't go through that analysis. And I think you knew the answer to the question before you asked it. There was no thought given, none whatsoever, to the impact of sequestration to the issues that you raise on the risk assessment. This was done at the 11th hour as the only way we could avoid the debt ceiling crisis. America defaulting on its debt. We already had some permanent damage because we took it too close. But if we actually defaulted, it would have been a much more severe impact on our country. And it looked like the only solution at the time, and therefore it was put into the package with no thought on the analysis that any scientist or anyone with any training in this field would have said, well, what happens if this happens? What are the trade-offs here? Is this worse than debt ceiling? The question you asked about closing of government. I mean, at some time you have to say the consequences of the compromise could be worse than what you're trying to avoid. I must tell you, I am convinced that sequestration will cause, has already caused, but will, if we don't get out of this by October 1, will cause really serious consequences of America's competitiveness, of our economy, of what we stand for as a nation, all of the above. So I've done a little bit of this analysis. I know what it does for education. I know what it does here at NASA. I know what it does at NIH. I know what it does at FDA. I know what it does in our support for local governments' economic growth programs. I know what it does for Chesapeake Bay. I know the impact it's going to have on areas that I care a lot about. And I would start looking at how you could accommodate this if I thought that we had a problem with affordability. But I look at America's wealth, and I think back to that time 12 years ago, and I'll leave you with this thought. 12 years ago, we balanced the federal budget by basically bringing in 20% of our economy in revenue and spending 20% of our economy in government spending. That's rough numbers, within 1 percentage point. Now, 12 years later, one could argue that the demographics of America has changed, that we should be above 20%. You could argue that. There are more older people, more services, et cetera. What we are saying, let's do the 20% rule. Let's bring revenues up to 20%. Let's bring spending down to 20%. And let's get on with a predictable budget. If you look at Simpson-Bowles, if you look at President Obama's proposal, you are getting back to that 20% level, basically is where they get to. And that's what we're trying to do. This is not too difficult. This is not a heavy political lift. All we're saying is let's have a reasonable expectation of what government should do, and let's pay our bills. We have the capacity to do that. I really believe we will get there. We may get there by this fall. It may take us a little bit longer, but I do believe that we're going to get back to about that level. By the way, that 20% level was pretty much what Ronald Reagan was asking for when he was president of the United States. And Ronald Reagan was never known as being a flaming liberal. So we really are trying to get back to a sensible government. Those who espouse that government can't do anything right and government's the problem, I think they're becoming less of a factor in Washington. I really think they are becoming less of a factor. I think Congress is trying to find that sweet spot of compromise, at least in the United States Senate. And we're going to do everything we can to promote that. And then we're going to need the public's help. This is a democratic country. That's why I think we're going to get gun safety legislation passed and immigration passed. We wouldn't get it passed by the votes right now in the House of Representatives. But I think we get this because this is a democratic government, and we do respond to what the public wants us to do. The public wants us to reach an agreement on the budget. They really do. And I think as a result, we have a reasonable chance to get our work done. I just want to, I guess, conclude by how I started, and thank you all for being willing to stand in the front lines of public service. I know it's not easy when you see what is said about federal workers or what you see happening with budgets, and you see the uncertainty and all this, and you say there's got to be an easier way of doing things, but yet you stick to public service. And I really do thank you for continuing. I know of no higher calling than the work that you do and how critically important it is to my children, my grandchildren, to our country. So again, thank you very much, and I thank you for giving me the honor of representing you in the United States Senate.
Senator, thank you very much for coming out and spending your precious time with us. I believe everybody sitting here today knows that they have a real friend in Washington in you. And you mentioned Landsat, and of course, you know Maryland and the Chesapeake. And we'd like to present you with an image from Landsat of the Maryland Chesapeake area.
That's wonderful. Thank you very much.
Thank you again.
Thank you. Appreciate it. It's true. My office was looking for a map of Maryland to put over my, it's perfect timing on this.
Great. Excellent. We'll get you a bigger one.
Yeah. That's great.
Okay, thanks everybody.